Lucy. This happened a couple of years back, but it's not the sort of thing I could forget easily. I was driving to visit my hospitalized mother, who'd suffered complications following a hip surgery. She lived across the country, so it was virtually a full day spent in the car. The weather was foul. A strong wind forced the rain nearly horizontally across the road. Thought it was only mid-afternoon, the street lamps had come on in the absence of sunlight, but the weak circles of illumination did little to clarify the road. Normally, I'd have taken a lunch break at Dorchester, but the traffic had slowed to nearly half its speed due to the bad visibility, and I figured it would be smart to stop early and hope the clouds broke up before the second stretch of my trip. I took a turnoff marked West Harrop. The road narrowed quickly, and scrubby trees crowded up to the edge of the asphalt. I leaned forward in my seat, squinting to make out the white stripes indicating the center of the road. Fog was rising out of the ditches either side of my car, spilling onto the street and clinging to the tree trunks. For a moment, I worried I might have taken a road to nowhere. Then the trees thinned, and I began to see a handful of houses, many made out of wood, though a few were brick, sitting on the hills that overlooked the road. I didn't see a single car for the entire drive. In fact, I didn't see any signs of life at all until I reached what had to be the city center, where a bundle of buildings were arranged haphazardly into a strip mall. The pub's parking lot was full. I supposed, if this were a farming town, the men wouldn't have much to do during such a severe rainstorm. I passed a real estate office with boarded-up windows and spray paint tags on its door. A group of squat houses broke up the shops, then a little farther on, I found a cafe. A few cars were parked out the front, and I drew my worn-out Chevy in as close to the door as I could get. Thunder rolled in the distance as I turned off the engine. I plucked my jacket off the passenger seat and opened my door. I moved as quickly as I could, but I was still drenched by the time I opened the diner's door. It was a small place and was dirtier than I'd expected. One of the fluorescent lights flickered every few seconds, but it didn't seem to bother the other occupants, who were mostly huddled at the back of the cafe and talking in low voices. I slipped into one of the tables close to the front window. The plastic tartan tablecloth crinkled as I rested my forearms on it, and the salt shaker was empty except for a few grains of rice. I picked up the menu and cringed at how tacky it felt. "What can I get you?" I turned to see a sallow-faced waitress hovering behind me. She forced a smile when I looked at her, but it didn't reach her eyes. I scanned the menu for something that had a low chance of giving me food poisoning and settled on the burger. In a burst of genius, I added, "Can I get that to go?" The waitress didn't reply, and I think I caught her scowling as she went through the double doors to the kitchen, but I didn't care as long as I could get out of the diner and back into the familiar comfort of my car. Maybe it was the rain, or maybe it was because of how anxious I was about my mother, but the town gave me the creeps. I gazed out the window at the rain pounding on the hood of my Chevy. Like the real estate office, the squat two-story building on the other side of the road looked abandoned. The only person on the street was a girl running through the rain, going from door to door on some mysterious errand. Only a handful of buildings had lights on. I caught hints of the discussion at the table at the back of the room, but it sounded flat and vapid. The waitress dropped a styrofoam clamshell box onto my table. "That's $8.50. I wasn't very reassured by how quickly the burger had been made, but I handed her a $10 note, took the box, and left the diner. I unlocked my car door, put the box on my dashboard, and was about to sink into the driver's seat when I heard a voice calling. The wind and rain were ferociously loud, making it nearly impossible to catch the words, but the voice's tone was urgent. I cautiously closed my car door and searched through the rain, shivering and cringing as the drops hit my face. Then I saw her. The little girl who'd been going door to door was dashing down the center of the street, fighting to be heard over the drumming rain and thunder. I watched as she banged on a house door then set off running again when no one answered. I was getting drenched, but I couldn't leave while the girl was obviously struggling to find help. I stepped forward and raised my hand to hail her. She saw and ran towards me. That's when I finally got a good look at her. She couldn't have been older than 10 or 11, and her simple white dress was discolored with mud and oil. Shoulder-length brown curls hung wet and limp about her cheeks, and her eyes were bulging out of her pale face. "Help!" she called, her bare feet slapping the muddy asphalt as she ran. Our car went off the road. "My mum's hurt. She's hurt really bad. I can't get her out." I felt my heart stutter. The girl was close enough for me to see a trickle of red coming from her temple. The blood mixed with rain, which diluted it to paint a pale pink streak down her cheek. "Okay," I said, looking about the street. It was empty. I turned back towards the diner and felt a flush of shock. The sallow-faced waitress stood at the door. She gazed at the girl for a moment, then looked at me, and raised her hand to the doorknob. I expected her to come out to see what the commotion was, but instead she turned the door's lock, then pulled a discolored cloth curtain over the glass part of the door. Shocked, I blinked at the locked door, unable to understand why the waitress would so pointedly refuse to help us. I turned back to the girl. Her eyes were fixed on mine, terrified and desperate, and I felt overwhelmingly underqualified to help. "Okay." I gazed at my car, the cafe, then down the deserted street. "It's going to be all right. Can you show me the way?" She grasped my hand. Her fingers were cold from running through the freezing rain as she led me off the main road and down a lane. She ran flat out while I jogged beside her. The rain had gotten through my jacket and soaked my shirt. I'd hoped the storm would ease during my stop, but if anything, the rain was getting heavier. I couldn't see more than a dozen paces ahead, though the girl seemed to know where she was going. We came to the end of the street, and she led me down a narrow dirt path that ran between two brick houses. Behind the houses, an incline led into a wooded area. She let go of my hand then so that she could scramble up the slope with all four limbs. I glanced at my shoes, they were leather and only a few weeks old, and cringed. A run through the woods would ruin them. I glanced up and saw the girl waiting for me at the edge of the woods. I took a gulp of air and clambered up the incline after her. She led me through the trees. The high branches caught the rain and poured it down on us in dribbles and splashes rather than drops. The wild, dark area had no clear paths and very little light. I nearly tripped over a root and cursed. "Please hurry," the girl begged, barely pausing to look back at me. "She's hurt bad. There's so much blood." Nausea grew in my stomach. If the mother was still alive and I didn't want to think about what would happen if she wasn't, would I be able to carry her through the forest and back to the town? I wasn't sure I would even be able to get her out of the car. I'd had some basic first aid training at one of my previous jobs, but I didn't have any medical supplies. I pulled my mobile out of my pocket and cursed when it showed no reception. The girl was able to weave through the woods faster than I could, and she quickly drew ahead of me. I tried to keep up, but the trees were close together, and I kept getting tangled in vines and bushes. "Slow down," I called. "I don't want to lose you. Please hurry." I gritted my teeth and pressed forward, ignoring the bruises forming on my shins and my stinging toes from where I'd stubbed them. I focused on keeping up with the pale girl weaving through the trunks ahead of me. I suddenly broke through a patch of bush and skidded to a halt, just inches from a steep ravine. I teetered, caught my balance, and took a step back. The cliff dropped down more than 20 feet before ending in a stream that shimmered dully in the rain. I looked across the ravine and saw a road chiseled into the side of the opposite mountain. "Down there," the girl whispered, pointing into the ravine. I crouched and squinted, looking for the car among the boulders and bushes around the creek. I couldn't make out the crash through the rain no matter how many times I passed my eyes over the gully. "Where is it?" I asked, glancing up. "I can't see." She was gone. I stumbled to my feet and turned in a complete circle, searching for the girl among the trees. "Hello," I called. All I could hear was the wail of the wind and the persistent drum of rain on the woods about me. I stood there for far too long, waiting for the girl to come back or call for me. I kept looking down into the gully, searching for the car, but I still couldn't see anything. When I finally looked up at the road on the opposite side of the ravine, I realized the railing was intact for as far as I could see it. I felt stupid and confused. With no other options, I turned and began walking back towards the town. It was a long, cold hike through the woods. I found it was easy to become disoriented in the pathless, dark maze, but I tried to walk straight as much as possible and eventually broke through the trees into a field. Another 20 minutes of walking brought me back to the city center drenched, shivering, and bruised from the trip through the woods. I sloshed through the puddles, passing the rows of deserted buildings and empty houses, until I reached the cafe and found my car waiting for me. I hesitated with one hand on the door as I tried to think of what the most reasonable action was. Should I tell someone about the girl? Should I just get into my car, drive out of the town as quickly as possible, and pretend none of the last 2 hours had happened? "Hey," someone called. I turned to find a police officer standing in the entrance to the cafe, leaning against the doorframe with his arms folded over his protruding stomach. He nodded towards my car. "Is that yours?" "Yeah," I said. "You'd better come in for a minute, son." I hesitated, wondering if I was in trouble. The officer had already turned and disappeared into the cafe, though, and I felt too cold and miserable to refuse him. Inside, the diners from earlier were gone, leaving the room empty except for me and the officer, who had sat at a table near the window. I sloshed over to him, leaving a wet trail on the wooden floor, and sat down. "Let me tell you, I'm glad you came back." The officer scratched at the stubble on his chin as he regarded me with amused gray eyes. "Annette told me you'd followed Lucy, so I was going to organize a search party if you didn't turn up soon. Not pretty weather for it, though." I blinked at him, trying to understand what he was getting at. Something bumped my arm, and I jumped as the sallow-faced waitress placed a mug of coffee on the table in front of me. "On the house," she said flatly, then pressed a bundle of dish towels into my hands. "Annette, you're a doll," the officer said as the waitress left. He turned back to me and grinned. "Did you make it all the way to the drop-off?" I dragged the towels through my damp hair as my brain scrambled to catch up. "There was a girl." Yeah, that's Lucy Mackenzie." The officer took a sip of his coffee. "I wish I could say she's the strangest thing about this town, but then, this is West Harrop." My frustration built as I rubbed my neck dry. "What do you mean?" "She said her car had crashed." "It sure did, son. Decades ago. It was a night not too different from this one, horrible rain. You could barely see the road in front of you. Yeah, their car went off the ravine on the Woodson's trail. The mother died at the scene, but Lucy managed to climb out of the creek and made it through the woods. Got all the way into town before she died from a brain hemorrhage. Passed away in the middle of the road before anyone could help her. It was a real tragedy." I'd frozen, wet towels still clasped in my hands, as I processed what he was implying. The officer nodded at my stunned expression. "She comes back any time there's a big storm and runs through the town, asking for help. We usually just shut our doors and block our ears till the rain passes, but I guess you didn't know about her, being from outside town and all. I'm glad you found your own way back, though. Not everyone does, and let me tell you, it's not fun looking for Lucy's helpers on nights like tonight." He put his empty coffee cup on the table and stood. I'd better be going, son. The radio says the storm will clear up in a couple of hours, so you might like to wait it out. If you do leave, though, make sure to be careful on the roads. The officer inclined his head towards the waitress and left the cafe with a bright jingle of its doorbell. My brain was reeling. I wanted to believe it was a big practical joke, but I'd seen the girl myself, watched the blood run down her face, heard her beg for help only to have her disappear and leave me with an intact stretch of railing and a gully that no longer held her car. I only stayed in the cafe for a few minutes. I nodded a mute thanks to Annette before leaving, and the smile I got in return was marginally more genuine than the one I'd received on arrival. Back in the car, I stripped off as many layers of soaked clothing as I dared, put them in a spare bag to stop them from leaking, turned the heater up and drove straight out of West Harrop. The officer had said Lucy wasn't the strangest thing about the town, and I had no intention of staying long enough to see what else there was. Next story. Sub-basement. It's your turn, Andrew said as he dropped a sheet of paper onto my desk. I glanced over the list of names and cursed under my breath. There had to be at least 20 of them. I could have sworn it was Carly's turn next. Andrew gave me a lopsided grin. Nope, she did the archive run last week. It's tax time, man. Everyone wants their records dug up. You know that. I glanced around and saw the half-dozen employees within hearing distance had stopped their work to listen in on the conversation. Most of them had the decency to swivel back to their computers when I made eye contact, but Tyson, the office joker, took the opportunity to pull out his tie and hold it taut above his head like a noose. I hated Tyson. You know how it works, Andrew said. Take a flashlight and a jacket and work fast. There are only 22 names here. It shouldn't take you more than half an hour. You'll be done before you know it. I grudgingly took the list and headed for the lift. Everyone hated getting the archive run. It was a trip into the very bottom level of the high-rise to retrieve or return files of customers who no longer did business with us. Normally, the visits were infrequent, once every 3 or 4 weeks, but over the last month, we've been inundated with customers wanting details of their cancelled accounts so they could lodge tax returns. I'd only done one archive run before, 8 months previously, for 2 folders, and I had no interest in repeating the experience. The archives level wasn't listed on the building's floor plans, but most people called it the sub-basement. It was permanently dark, icy cold and smelt like rotting paper and plants. Many rumors circulated about the neglected level. Most were probably hyperbolic, but enough had a ring of truth to them to make the sub-basement a favorite gossip point in the office. I got into an empty lift and selected the blank button at the bottom of the panel. The carriage held still for a second before beginning its descent. I wiped my sweating palms on my pants and loosened my tie. It's no big deal, I told myself. Dozens of people had made the run without seeing anything out of the ordinary. And even when, well, Joan had suffered from a heart condition, anyway. The display above the elevator's door listed the levels we were passing. I worked near the top of the building, on the 18th floor. The numbers descended until they read 0, the first basement, then 00, the second basement. The display froze at 00 while the cart continued to descend into the sub-basement. The elevator stopped with a jolt, and the doors slid open. Outside was a long corridor. I could only see as far as the elevator's light penetrated. Beyond that was ink black. I stepped out and reached to the right. A row of flashlights and waterproof jackets hung from hooks on the concrete wall. I took one of each and turned my light on as the elevator's doors closed. The sub-basement's lights had failed 4 years ago, leaving it in permanent darkness. Management had hired electricians, but the lights couldn't be repaired without drilling into the concrete supports and compromising the stability of the building. Management had promised to put up temporary lights, but somehow, they never made it into the budget. I flicked my torchlight across the walls of the corridor. The concrete was discolored from a steady seepage of water. Carts, the kind used in libraries, stood against the walls. Most were broken. Rust had stained many of them red. 22 folders would be a large armful, but not enough to make me search for a working cart. I hurried past them. The double door at the end of the hallway used a push handle to open. I pressed on it, but it stuck. I grimaced and rose onto my toes, putting my full weight on the handle, until it scraped down and opened the doors. The stories about the sub-basement were copious and of dubious veracity. Paul from IT told anyone who would listen that it was never supposed to be built, but the construction crew made a mistake when reading the plans. I thought Paul was full of it. Preeta had said she saw rats the size of small dogs when she was on an archive run. I'm a little more inclined to believe her, she tends to be honest. The worst were the stories about the 5 employees who'd quit, each after going on an archive run. Supposedly, they'd asked for their unpaid salary to be mailed to them, then walked straight out of the building, not even stopping long enough to clean out their desks or say goodbye. I'd thought the stories were fiction, until I witnessed it myself. The most recent quitter was Riley, who had worked opposite me. He was a quiet guy, but we'd gotten along well. I'd always thought he was reliable. Steady. Then one afternoon, he went on an archive run and didn't come back. HR told us he had quit. They cleaned out his desk overnight. The rumor mill had a field day. I moved my torch about the sub-basement, squinting to pick out shapes in the dancing light. To the left were filing boxes stacked nearly to the ceiling. Immediately in front of me and to the right were shelves, nearly 100 of them, with thousands upon thousands of files. The air was incredibly cold. I held the torch with my teeth and tucked the paper between my knees before slipping into the waterproof jacket. It wouldn't provide much warmth, but at least it would protect me from the drips. The room was about the size of a football field. Most of the files had been accumulated before the company went digital 5 years previously, and HR didn't have any motivation or room to move them to a higher, warmer level. I suspect HR would have found plenty of motivation if they were the ones responsible for archive runs. The files were divided into 3 sections, one for each decade the company had been operating, and each decade was arranged alphabetically according to the customer's surname. My list had the decades handwritten next to the names, and was arranged from most recent to oldest. First up were 8 names from the last decade, which would be found in the boxes to the left of the door. The universal advice was to get in and out of sub-basement quickly. The more time people spent there, the wilder their tales became. Jerome said he believes there's a gas leak with hallucinogenic properties. He has warned every new employee not to light up in the sub-basement in case it triggered an explosion. I couldn't smell anything, but that didn't mean he wasn't right. The first file, Anderson, Patricia, was easy to find, and I pulled it out of its box. Something rattled from farther in the room. I froze, listening hard. Silence. I exhaled through my teeth and started scanning the names again. Gregory thought bats had infested in the sub-basement. He'd supposedly found a nest of them in the corner of the room, but they were blind and deformed, and they'd screamed at him when he got too close. I found the second and third names together and tugged them both out. I set my small pile on the ground and went to work looking for the fourth name. Something brushed my ankle, and I jumped back, bumping into the shelves behind me and nearly knocking them over. The flashlight's beam was jittery as I angled it at the ground, but I felt a buzz of relief when I saw the strip of plastic wrap poking out from under the boxes. I must have grazed it. I moved forward again to continue my search and felt something prickly stick into my neck. I swiped at it. The sensation clung to my hand as I pulled it away and angled my flashlight at it. A glossy black insect hung on my fingers. It was large and flat, and its body was segmented like a wasp's. Its 6 legs had hooks that dug into my skin, and large mandibles protruded from its oblong face. I let out a choked cry of disgust and tried to flick the insect off, but it dug its spiked legs in harder, piercing my skin. Desperate, I slapped the back of my hand against the bookcase, hoping to crush the creature. Its body convulsed on impact, and it dropped to the ground, then scuttled under the shelf. I drew in shallow, ragged breaths as I moved away and brought the flashlight up to examine my hand. The cuts were small, but they stung. Something on my arm moved at the same time as I became aware of many small objects hanging onto my back. I froze, then carefully turned the light towards my arm. One of the insects, larger than the first, clung to my elbow. I pointed my torch over the railing, but the light wasn't strong enough to bring the floor below into relief. All I could make out were some shelves and what looked like a lounge area. "Damn it," I whispered. A basement below the sub-basement. No one from the office had said anything about another level. I moved with intense caution, brushing one hand against the wall to my left and swinging the torch across the steps in front of my feet. 10 steps down, the railing to my right disappeared. Where it ended was bent, as though someone had torn off a section. I moved closer to the wall. Another 5 steps and I nearly slipped. The metal slats had been dry up to that point, but some type of slime, unnervingly similar to what had dripped onto the back of my neck, coated the rest. I slowed down even more, placing each foot with painstaking care. A little farther on, the slime developed on the wall. It felt strangely warm under my fingers, and I recoiled in disgust. I became aware of the stench of organic decay. The farther down the stairs I went, the stronger it became until it felt like as if it were coating my tongue. I reached the concrete floor and stopped to catch my breath. My fingers were shaking as I loosened my tie to allow for easier breathing. The room wasn't as large as the floor above had been, but it was deep. I angled my light up the stairs and could barely make out the top. I turned slowly, bringing shapes into focus with the narrow beam of my torch, and gazed into the room with sick fascination. Shelves, much like in the room above, stood in 2 straight rows through the center of the room. 2 of the closer ones had fallen over like dominoes, the first propped up by a lounge. Folders and pieces of paper had fallen out of it and were scattered across the floor. I turned my flashlight over the mess. Many of the files had rotted in the dampness, but the ones towards the top were still mostly intact. Typewritten titles such as Case 2461 and Case 9330 were displayed on the front. I nudged one of the folders open with my shoe and instantly recoiled. Inside was a black and white photograph of a disfigured man. He was missing both eyes, and where his nose should have been was a black hole. An open mouth showed badly deformed teeth. To either side of him, 2 doctors, passive, expressionless, and dressed in white lab coats, held the man still with a hand on each of his arms. I shuddered as I turned away. To the left of the shelves were lounges. I skipped my light over them in morbid fascination. They were badly decayed, sagging and rotting, probably the cause of the stench. Several had large stains on them. The discoloration was spread across the backrest and concentrated on the cushions below, almost as if, no, I told myself. No, not as if people had been left to rot in the seats. That's a dangerous way to be thinking. Find the folder and get out. I moved between the shelves, looking for the familiar customer folder markings, but they were all numbers. Case 0058, Case 4902. No names. Damn it, where are you, Clarissa? I panned my torch across the walls, looking for any bookcases or filing cabinets I might have missed. Paintings had been glued to the wall opposite me, creating a haphazard patchwork of color. They depicted strange faces and distorted shapes. I was close to giving up when my light passed over a door at the back of the room. Bronze signs were posted above it. Respite rooms, pharmacy, conditioning rooms, Brightwater accountants, archive. I chewed on the inside of my cheek. I'd thought the whole building belonged to Brightwater. Maybe another business worked in the basement levels at one time. Perhaps the company's owner, Paul Brightwater, had rented the basement when he started his business, then bought the entire building later on. That would explain why the file for Clarissa Perrick, one of Brightwater's first customers, was squirreled away in the nightmarish sub-basement. I glanced back at the numbered files and the rotting lounges, then pushed through the metal door. A long corridor with multiple doors stretched in front of me. I moved carefully, swinging my light to check the plaques above each side chute. The doors were old, many of the hinges were rusted, and the glass panes set in the front were blurry from accumulated dust and grease. I peered through the window of the first door I passed, labeled respite rooms. Beyond it was another long hallway with many doors of its own. Medical trays were left abandoned along the walls. The window was too blurry to offer a clear view, but I thought I glimpsed movement near the back of the hallway. I paused, holding my torch still, but I couldn't see anything else. My curiosity wasn't strong enough to make me linger, so I quickened my pace as I passed the other passageways. Brightwater Accountants was the last door to the left. I paused in the entryway and moved my torch over the room. It was a small office with a bare, defunct bulb hanging from the ceiling and age stains across the walls. A cheap desk sat to one side with two broken chairs opposite it. Behind the desk was a filing cabinet, which I hurried to and opened eagerly. "Come on, Clarissa Perrick, where are you?" I muttered to myself. I checked under P and felt sick when I found only 4 files there, none of them belonging to Clarissa. I'd come too far to turn back empty-handed. I checked under C, in case she had accidentally been filed under her first name. When I didn't find her there, I began to rifle through the other folders, desperate and frustrated. She wasn't there. I slammed the drawer closed in a fit of anger, and froze as the slamming noise echoed back at me from the hallway. I moved to the office door and shone my light down the length of the hallway. It was empty, but the door at the end was closed. My breath whistled as I let it out through clenched teeth and began jogging for the door. To hell with Brightwater and their missing files. They'll have to do without. I pushed the door's handle to open it. It stuck in place. I pushed harder, then pulled, jiggled the handle, and pressed my entire weight on it. It didn't budge. I'd been locked in. My flashlight beam jittered over the walls as I turned and looked down the hallway. Had the door locked itself, like they did in some hospitals? Was there a button to open it again? No, no button. I found only stained concrete walls, stained concrete floor, and blank metal doors with fogged glass. I knelt beside the door and tried to slow my breathing while I thought. They'll come looking for me if I'm down here for too long. Just like they'd searched for Joan. I cringed and pressed my sweating palms against my eyelids. I would never forget the moment they brought Joan out of the sub-basement. Nearly everyone from my floor had stayed late as we waited for news. We'd congregated outside the lifts, talking in hushed voices as police and emergency workers swarmed through the building. The lights above the only elevator that went to the sub-basement lit up. We pushed forward, eager to see Joan, ask her what had gone wrong, and possibly hear a new tale of the macabre firsthand. But the elevator doors opened, and all that came out were 4 rescue workers and a sheet-covered body on a gurney. She'd had heart problems, I reminded myself. You're young and fit, and they'll find you. Eventually. I stood up. There was another option. Health and safety codes meant that every building above a certain size had to have 2 exits for each floor. There was another way out. I started down the hallway. The room at the end, Brightwater's office, was a dead end. So was the pharmacy, which was missing its door. I glanced inside but didn't linger, every drawer and cupboard was open and empty. The door to the conditioning rooms was locked. That left the respite rooms. The handle creaked when I pressed on it, but it opened, granting me access to the long hallway of abandoned medical carts and closed doors. I shone my light at the first door to my left. Through the blurred glass, I was able to make out a metal examination table. Leather straps were draped over its dulled surface, and the concrete floor was stained. The following 4 doors all led to bedrooms. They had identical accommodations: plain, rusted metal bed frames held mattresses in varying stages of decay. A chair and a bedpan sat neatly against the walls. A single hand-painted sheet of paper hung above each of the beds. 2 had nature scenes, 1 was abstract splotches of color, and 1 depicted a face with no eyes. The hallway turned a corner. As I walked, I became aware of a noise behind me. It sounded almost like shuffling, stuttering steps on the concrete floor. I froze. As though it were a switch being turned, the noise stopped. An echo? I held my breath and scuffed my shoe across the ground. It made a dull thumping noise. No echo. I started walking again. The noise was gone, but a horrible feeling of dread had taken its place. I walked faster and faster, and the flashlight's beam jittered erratically in front of me as I broke into a sprint. I didn't bother stopping to look into the rooms I passed. I just wanted to get out of there. I rounded another corner, and the hallway ended in a double door, just like the entryway to the sub-basement. Sweat trickled down the back of my neck even as the icy air coaxed plumes of condensation out of my breath. I was shivering almost too severely to keep the light steady as I pressed my face against the cold metal door and peered through the glass window. It was too blurred for me to see anything. I flexed my shoulders, took a deep breath, and pushed the handle down. The door opened, and I could have laughed from relief. A landing stretched for a few feet ahead of me. Beyond that, stairs led upwards. Then I raised my torch and saw the rubble. There had been a cave-in, probably a long time ago, from how settled it looked. Slabs of concrete, natural rock, bricks, and dirt mingled in a pile partway up the stairs, effectively blocking the exit. I ran my hand over my mouth. I might still be able to dig my way through. If the rubble isn't too deep, I could shift enough to get past it, get back to the sub-basement, take the lift up to the 22nd floor, and hand in my resignation, just like all of the other souls who quit after doing a basement run. The entire area was smothered in thick dust. I shrugged out of my jacket and tried to find somewhere clean to hang it. Eventually, I slung it over a metal support that stuck out from the broken wall. I began climbing the rubble, moving slowly and testing each foothold to make sure it was solid. I hadn't gone more than a few steps when I noticed something strange. Other footprints marred the dust. They were fainter than mine and belonged to smaller shoes. Someone had been there before me. I crouched down to get a closer look at the print. I guessed it belonged to a woman's shoe, and, although it had left a clear imprint in a half-inch thick layer of grime, fresh sheets of dust softened its appearance. It was old. Maybe the owner of this print been faced by the same obstacle as myself, but gotten through. I followed the tracks up the collapsed stairwell, turning my light backwards and forwards over the debris to follow the progress of the scuffed footprints and occasional smudge from where a hand had been used. Near the top of the pile, the tracks stopped. I looked for a gap in the debris and held up my hand to feel for a breeze, but the way was clearly blocked. I sat down on a slab of concrete and evaluated my situation. To my right, a strange shape leaned against the wall. I jerked backwards in shock and turned my torch towards it. Coiled up in the corner, leaning against the wall and holding a folder tightly to its chest, was a human body. At first, I thought it was a skeleton, but it still had skin, dried and stretched tight across the bones after months of exposure to the icy air. Its eye sockets were empty, and its mouth was open, exposing a shriveled tongue and discolored teeth. Dirty blonde hair lay in limp coils on its shoulders. I looked more closely at its clothes, and a horrible sick feeling surged through me as I recognized our office uniform. The clue to the body's identity was the shoes, leather, with red buckles. Only one person in the office had worn shoes like that. Joan. I thought I was going to be sick. I ran my hands over my face as I tried to slow my racing heart. This thing crouched in the corner can't be Joan. We all saw her carried out of the lift. That wasn't true, though. We'd seen something carried out on a stretcher, but the cloth had never been lifted. She'd had a closed coffin funeral, too. I wiped my hands across my eyes, smudging away tears and leaving dust in its place. If Joan came this far before giving up. Her bony hands were clamped over a plain manila folder. I had a terrible premonition of what it would contain, and I leaned forward just far enough to reach it. Without disturbing Joan's body, I pulled the folder's corner back to expose the name inside, Peric, Clarissa. I slumped back, resting against the concrete block, a bitter taste permeating my mouth. Cold dust billowed around me, prickling at my skin and irritating my eyes. I let out my breath in a long heave, watching it make the dust swirl. Something on the other side of the door imitated my exhale. I scuttled back, my heart thumping, as something large and dark reached up to scratch at the foggy glass. Andrew, arms crossed over his chest, listened to Thompson's speech as he leaned against Matt's desk. It had been cleared during the night. Yes, sadly, Matt handed in his resignation yesterday afternoon, Thompson said. He turned his head slowly to survey the gathered staff. He was an excellent worker, and we wish him all the best in his future career. We understand it will leave a hole in this team, but we hope to hire a replacement within the week. Thank you. The murmurs started immediately. I can't believe it, Madison said. I thought he loved this job. I had no idea he was thinking about leaving. You know what this means, don't you? Jacob said. This is the 6th person who's left after a basement run. There's something not right down there. You know, during my last trip Andrew tuned out the chatter as a heavy hand landed on his shoulder. He turned to see Thompson beaming at him. Andrew, right? I have a job for you. You see, when Matt was fetching the folders on Friday, he missed one, Clarissa Peric. I can trust you to find it for us, can't I? Sure thing. Next story. The Watcher. It was a bad night to do the challenge. The thin crescent moon kept slipping behind the clouds, and a harsh wind tugged dying leaves off the trees and sent them skittering across the driveway. Jasmine got out of the van she'd been forced into and pulled her dressing gown tightly around her body. They'd parked in a large clearing that bordered a nature reserve, and banks of tall pine trees rose above them, making long shadows across the grass. They'd passed a home, its lights off and curtains drawn, farther up the driveway, but it was no longer in sight. Jasmine had seen a sign for a second in the van's headlights, but she hadn't been able to read it properly. Truck it pros and the article, or something like that. An animal cried in the woods and another creature answered almost immediately. As her eyes adjusted to the dark, Jasmine began to make out details of her surroundings. The clearing was about 20 feet wide and surrounded by trees on all sides. To the left was some sort of shed, teetering on the edge of a steep incline into a gully. The shed looked like a lighthouse sitting on the brink of a cliff, and the wildly swaying trees were the waves threatening to submerge it. To the right was an open workshop. Rusty saws and axes glittered in the thin moonlight. Her masked companion got out of the van's driver's seat. Down towards the shed, she instructed, and Jasmine reluctantly obeyed. She was halfway there before she saw the 3 other hooded people standing in the shed's shadow. Like her companion, they wore thick black robes that trailed on the ground behind them. The hoods were drawn up over their hair, and blank white masks covered their faces. "Welcome, friend," the middle figure said, and Jasmine recognized Aaron's voice. Aaron was the leader of the group and had probably planned the evening's entertainment. "Hello," Jasmine said stupidly, hugging her body and shivering. Aaron stretched out her gloved hands, palms upwards, and raised her masked face towards the sky. "We have brought you here tonight for a test of bravery. Pass, and you will be welcomed into our order. Fail, and you will leave disgraced." The figure to Aaron's left giggled nervously, but a glare from her companion quickly silenced her. The giggle gave away her identity, though. Only Hannah laughed like that. They were piling on the dramatics, and Jasmine had to admit, it was working. The cloaks, the masks, and the remote location were making her skin crawl. She'd never been good at handling fear. She hated horror movies and still occasionally had nightmares from a haunted house amusement ride her parents had taken her on as a child. Of all the challenges they could have planned, they had to pick bravery, huh? Just my luck. Aaron, who seemed to be getting a kick out of Jasmine's fear, raised her voice. "The rules are simple. When the bell tolls midnight, you will step into the watching room." She indicated the shed to Jasmine's left. "When the bell tolls 1, you may come out. There is a window in the shed. As long as you are inside, you must be the watcher and stare through the glass. If you look away from the window, you fail. If you turn the light on, you fail. If you leave the room before the bells toll, you fail." She paused, letting the silence stretch out, then continued in a quieter voice. "But if you can watch for the full hour, you will have proven your courage, and your initiation will be complete. Do you understand?" "Yes," Jasmine said, trying to smile. She wished they wouldn't make such a big deal of it. When Aaron had told her she would need to pass an initiation to be a part of their book club, she'd assumed it would be an embarrassing prank or maybe a small act of vandalism. Aaron had never given so much as a hint that she was interested in the cultish, horror-fueled test of bravery she'd established. Jasmine looked at the 3 silent figures beside Aaron. She'd gotten on well with them before, but it was so much harder to talk with them when they wore masks. "Did you all have to pass, too?" "Yep," Hannah said proudly before Aaron could glare her into silence. "Even Aaron did it." It was ages ago, though, the person to Aaron's right added, and the accent told Jasmine it was Tasha. That meant the 4th figure, the one who'd driven her there, was Mel. "We did it when we were kids," Hannah said. "This place has hardly changed, though." "Some things never change," Aaron said, making her voice low and ominous. Jasmine could tell she'd been waiting for an opening for her story. "Things like the stalker." Mel shivered under her cloak, and Hannah let out another nervous laugh. Aaron walked forward and began circling Jasmine with slow, ponderous steps, her feet scraping through the dead leaves. "The stalker has lived in these woods for longer than anyone can remember. They say it's a horrible monster, half bat and half human, that drags its live prey deep into the forest to consume. It's often been seen from the window in the watching room as it stalks its victims." Hannah's giggles became higher and more sporadic. She was really, truly frightened, Jasmine realized. "Your job as the watcher is to watch for the stalker," Aaron continued. "If you see it, don't look away. The stalker won't attack as long as you keep your eyes on it, but as soon as you turn to run," she drew her gloved finger across her throat in a slow sweep, then leant forward to whisper into Jasmine's ear, "Don't look away." "What the hell sort of hazing is this?" Jasmine rubbed at her arms as goosebumps rose over them. "I'm trying to join a book club, not a cult." She knew Aaron was trying to scare her, and she was a little ashamed to admit it was working. The animal chattering from the gully was taking on a new dimension. The calls, the wails, and even the rustling of the leaves raised Jasmine's heart rate. What would a stalker sound like? The clamor of nature was suddenly interrupted by a deep, melodic boom. The town hall bell, the sound of which traveled across the woods, was announcing midnight. "It's time," Aaron said. She, Hannah, and Tasha began walking up the driveway, leaving Mel to pull a large, ornate metal key out of her pocket and unlock the shed's door. "I'll see you in an hour, I guess," Jasmine said, trying to inject some lightness into her voice. "Let's hope the stalker doesn't show up, huh?" The lock clicked, and Mel put the key back into her pocket. The town hall's bell was still ringing, blending with the noise from the gully. "It's real, you know." She reached up to pull her mask over her hood. Her round face was flushed and sweaty, but her dark eyes were serious. "I know you think it's something Aaron made up, but it's not. It's a local urban legend. There are stories about the stalker from when the town was being settled. You're new here, so you wouldn't have seen them, but the newspaper sometimes runs articles on it, too." "What?" "Just thought you should know," Mel said, and Jasmine caught a glimpse of a wicked grin before the mask was lowered back into place. The town hall finished its 12th chime, leaving the air saturated with its echoes, somehow heavier from the oppressive silence. Mel placed a hand on the wooden door and pressed it open. "In you go." Jasmine could feel her fingers shaking, but she couldn't turn back. She'd been spending time with the four women for over a month, and when Aaron had invited her to join their club, which they'd apparently started as children, she knew she would do anything it took to be included, even spending an hour as a watcher. She stepped over the threshold of the shed, and the door clicked shut behind her. Mel didn't lock it, though, and Jasmine was grateful. The shed was completely empty and felt larger than it had looked from the outside. Wooden floors met wooden walls, which, in turn, disappeared into a wooden ceiling draped with spiderwebs. Aaron had said there was a window, but that wasn't strictly true. Jasmine felt a swell of fear rise through her as she faced a wall made entirely out of glass. There were no supports and no metal bars to segment the pane. It stretched seamlessly from the left wall to the right, and from her slippers to 5 feet above her head. As she stepped up to the window, she felt as though she might be sucked through it and into the forest beyond. The view would have been stunning at any other time, but that night, it was like something out of her nightmares. The incline dropped away from the edge of the shed, creating a slope of grass splattered with underbrush and scrappy weeds. The clearing rushed to blend with the claustrophobic woods beyond. It was a mess of shadows, where spears of moonlight and gashes of darkness mixed and fought for dominance, dancing and darting as the wind threw the trees' branches about with ecstatic abandon. The sounds bled through the gaps in the shed wall. She could hear the calls of small mammals, the rasping chatter of bats, and a bleat from deep in the woods that rose in pitch before abruptly cutting off. Jasmine struggled with herself, fighting to keep her feet planted where they were and to get her breathing under control as gnawing anxiety made her legs weak and her fingers shake. "Don't lose," she told herself. "Don't let their stories get into your head. This is fine. You're safe. Nothing can get in here." She felt vulnerable, though, exposed by that window, as though she could fall through it at any moment, to be dragged away by the stalker. There's no such thing as a stalker. Even her internal voice sounded panicked. Jasmine closed her eyes for a moment, then forced them open again. Aaron and her friends were probably making sure she didn't look away. They might have hidden a camera somewhere in the corner of the room, or they could have been in the woods at that moment, watching and laughing as she trembled, alone, in the shed. Something moved between the trees, and Jasmine's heart skipped a beat. She focused on it, trying to make out the shape among the mess of shadows and plants. Some sort of animal sent up a chatter, a harsh scratch. She tried to guess how long she'd been in the shed, but time felt unstable there, as if it passed differently on the outside world. She thought that at least half an hour had gone by, though. Her feet were starting to get tired. The wind picked up a notch, and the shed creaked, making a laborious sound that started to her right and traveled over the roof. More movement appeared among the trees, though it might have just been a trick of the light. She scanned the scene, letting her eyes linger over the darkest parts, trying to identify shapes. A rock a little way down the gully looked as though it had eyes. Jasmine stared at it, then smothered a shriek as it moved. The rock wasn't a rock after all, but a creature hunched on the ground, watching her intently. It rose to a half-crouch and began creeping up the gully. All of her false confidence left her. She would have run if her legs hadn't been drained of their energy. It can't be real, her mind gibbered as she struggled to draw breath, watching the creature slink closer to her window. It's got to be an animatronic or a special effect or a costume. She remembered the sign that had been nearly hidden by the trees at the head of the driveway, and the correct words came to her instantly: Truscott's Prosthetics and Theatrical Makeup. Erin's surname was Truscott, but her parents lived near the town center. This property must belong to an uncle or a grandfather, then. Someone who makes theater costumes and does makeup. Erin's resourceful. Of course she'd take full advantage of her relative's craft to make tonight an event I'll never forget. Why just talk about a stalker when you can make one appear? This knowledge was like a rush of warm water. No wonder Erin had been so insistent that Jasmine not look away from the window. They didn't want her to miss a second of their elaborate fright fest. Better luck next time, Erin. Jasmine tried to smile, but her face felt frozen. She was certain the thing in the gully was one of her friends dressed in an elaborate costume, but fear continued to crawl across her skin, itching at her back and making her feel sick. The monster in the gully was creeping closer, keeping its body low to the ground, its yellow eyes fixed on Jasmine's. Don't look away. It was entirely gray and wore no clothes. She couldn't imagine any of the friends stripping naked for a prank, so she guessed it was a monster bodysuit. The yellow contacts would have been a pain to put it. They've really put a lot of effort into this. She would have been impressed with some quick makeup, maybe a wig and some tattered clothes, but the creature was above and beyond. It even moved animalistically, using all four limbs to creep up the steep incline, its body twisting lithely. She could swear she saw the spine writhe under its skin. That's enough, she whispered. Please, no more. As if it could hear her, the creature turned, leaving its course, and circled the building. She watched it until it disappeared from view. Her chest ached from the stress. Her heart was thundering, and her body was sticky with sweat under her dressing gown. She tried to swallow and found her throat was dry. Please let that be it, she begged. I want this hour to be over already. A scream, shrill and inhuman, came from behind her. Jasmine jumped and shrieked herself, and it took all of her resolve to stay facing the glass wall. You're the watcher. Watch the window. Don't turn around, or you fail. The scream became raw, thick with terror, then it ended abruptly. Don't let them scare you. You're stronger than this. Jasmine reached up and rubbed the tears off her cheek. She'd never felt fear so intensely. They're trying their best to make you leave, but you're going to win. The silence stretched out. Jasmine kept her eyes on the woods below, following the rules to the letter. Her chest ached, and her limbs shook as she stood, watching the flickering shadows and swaying trees in the gully. Then a deep, melodic boom came from the town. Her hour was up. I did it. She finally turned and stumbled towards the door, her relief and exhilaration battling with her still-present fear. I did it. She opened the door, hoping for cheers and welcoming hugs, but the clearing was empty. Jasmine scanned the edges of the wood, looking for movement. They must have gone to wait back at the house. Geez, you'd think they'd be a little bit more considerate after what they put me through. She started walking and tripped over a dark shape at the foot of the shed. She screamed and landed in the dirt, then pushed back quickly to see what she'd fallen over. Erin lay on her front, her head twisted up to stare in horror at the crescent moon. Her face was painted white with dark patches drawn about her eyes. Plastic fangs peeked over her bottom lip, just above a dribble of blood. A vampire. Erin's interpretation of half-human and half-bat. Jasmine's brain sluggishly put the pieces together as she sat on the ground, too shocked and frightened to move. She must have been waiting for me to leave when the hour ended. Then she heard the noise, a scratch, from the opposite end of the clearing. Jasmine raised her eyes and saw it creep out from the trees. Its leathery gray skin slid over angular bones as it paced towards her, its body moving fluidly, its harsh yellow eyes fixed on hers. "Don't look away,"